VSV, and the one we use is an attenuated strain called VSV Delta M51, which has an increased safety profile. VSV has been shown to reduce tumor size in melanoma, lung cancer, and colon cancer models. It's also amenable to genetic manipulation, as I kind of talked earlier about. We can insert genes into the genome and have the virus itself express it, which can increase the efficacy of VSV. And what we put in our VSV is called fusion-associated small transmembrane proteins, or FAST proteins, and in this case I'll be talking about the FAST protein P14. And what this does is it basically causes cell-to-cell fusion and allows the virus to travel more through tumor cells, and therefore allowing it to infect more cells and cause higher tumor inflammation. So as you can kind of see in this picture, the VSV P14 causes a lot of cell fusion. And this cell fusion makes the tumor a lot hotter and allows it to be better combined with immunotherapies. And the immunotherapy that we use is called natural killer T cells, or NK T cells. They're a specialized subset of T lymphocytes that recognize glycolipids instead of peptides. Their main role is they contribute to basal cancer immunosurveillance, and infiltration into NK T cells into cancer is associated with good prognosis. And we can therapeutically activate NK T cells by injecting DCs loaded with glycolipids. So this is what I did. I combined those VSVs with the FAST protein P14 with NK T cell immunotherapy in metastatic breast cancer. And what we found is that when we combine VSV P14 with loaded DCs, the NK T cell therapy, we get 100% survival of mice in this metastatic breast cancer model compared to VSV GFP with the NKT, which led to about 75%. The viruses on their own lead to some increased survival time, but don't lead to any overall survival. So this 100% survival has gotten us thinking about moving into clinics, this and some other data that I won't be showing you today. But it makes us excited and makes us think that, hey, this could move into humans and go into clinical trial. So that is kind of the case study that we're going to be using going forward. Why won't it let me stop sharing my screen? There we go.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. I'm just going to stall a bit here while I try to get my screen up. Really interesting stuff, and it's going to be a really good case study, I think, to apply this presentation I'm going to share with you folks here. So this presentation will probably take about 20 minutes, and it was intended to be a framework that we could use to further hopefully a very robust discussion with our panelist members. And so it's looking at things at a high level in terms of, you know, the steps you need to take and considerations that you should have in terms of translating this bench discovery into the clinic. So really quickly, what I'll cover in this presentation is what exactly is translational medicine, an approach to developing a translational plan. So looking at it in terms of like 3 discrete sorts of concepts: formulating your plan, implementing your plan, and executing your plan. And then if there's time, I will look to talking a little bit about the lessons learned that I've experienced. So as Megan mentioned, so my expertise and experience has been in biomanufacturing. It has been predominantly from in an academic environment. So I'll be looking at things through that lens predominantly, but I have had experience in industry. And I continue to interface with, you know, industry, not-for-profits, and patient groups through my various roles. But that's also why we have the expert panels that we do, who this is their bread and butter. Megan mentioned Mike Jameson, who will give us that regulatory perspective, and of course Jody, who will give us the industry perspective. So with that, so you have worked tirelessly in the lab, as I'm sure Adam can attest to, spending, you know, months and years working on the same project, and then through all your blood, sweat, and tears, you finally have it. You've discovered something. And if you're a BioCanRx investigator, that's probably some sort of novel disruptive immunotherapy that will have the potential to change the lives of cancer patients in Canada. But what do you do next? So that brings me to the topic of translational medicine. So what is translational medicine? It's important to recognize that translational medicine is not a singular effort. It truly is the culmination of a number of parts with input from a variety of subject matter expertise or experts. And because of that, it's really an interdisciplinary branch of the biomedical field, and it's supported by these three main pillars. By nature, it necessitates a highly collaborative approach between these three pillars. So we're talking between the scientists in the laboratory, the clinicians in the clinic, and of course, the community being our ultimate stakeholder, or patients in the patient advocacy community. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. So you are embarking on your translational science or medicine journey. What do you do? So the first thing, as I'd mentioned, is you need to formulate a plan. And to do that, one approach to this is getting to know your discovery incredibly well. And you do that by being very critical and assessing the who, what, where, why, and when of this discovery. So who, to me, is probably one of the most important questions you're going to have to ask. And it's going to require some introspection on your part as a scientist, in part because you'll have to recognize that you are not all things to all people. You are the subject matter expert when it comes to your discovery. However, to be able to move through the various activities that are going to be required to get this product into people, you're going to need a team of subject matter experts. That team can include other scientists, clinicians, potentially industry as a partner, if that's the route you decide to take, and of course, end users. And so just a quick note to this, I mean, this is something that we're very familiar with at BioCanRx. We look to patients and patient advocacy as an important part of the translational continuum. And for instance, we had a project a year or so back where we were developing a clinical trial protocol for our CD19 CAR-T program. And integral to that was the involvement of a patient advocate who helped develop the clinical protocol along with our scientists and clinicians to talk about what is feasible for patients. And that turned out to be very, very advantageous to this program. Another who to consider is who are the sorts of people that may want to fund what it is that you are researching. And so this could be the government agencies like NSERC, CIHR, SSHRC, and then of course not-for-profits like Terry Fox Research Institute, BioCanRx, can't forget us, Canadian Cancer Society, and provincial specific funders such as like OICR. Another consideration too is that private industry may have an interest in supporting the development of your innovation. Typically, or at least historically, industry has waited until technologies are substantially de-risked before they want to provide additional investment. However, with the advent of these virtual companies that don't have a physical laboratory presence, we are seeing involvement of industry earlier on in the funding aspect of the development of technologies, because it does give them an opportunity to have maybe more control over the process and ultimate direction that the product is going to take. So that is still an option earlier on, but is typically something that industry will engage with a little bit later on. What is it that you actually have is another question you need to look at. So you need to critically define what your discovery is and look at what its path will be and what it is ultimately worth. So for the instance, if I'm referring back to Adam's example, he's dealing with what looks like a product and actually a combination therapy. So the combination of the oncolytic or the VSV and the NKT cells. Is this something that's completely new, or is it an improvement on an existing idea? So it sounds as though, you know, it's a little bit of both with Adam. However, used in combination is where I think the innovation actually lies. And then in this case, this is where you need to be starting to talk about, can I or should I patent this? How are you going to proceed with protecting your innovation? Is this something you ultimately want to do? And so to circle back to the who and the team section, or the team aspect, this is where, you know, having engagement early on with your technology transfer IP office within your academic institution is important. They'll be the ones to help you answer this. Also in terms of what, and when you consider IP, you need to think also about how you want to disclose your innovation. We're all scientists, and we love to talk about what it is that we do, sometimes to the disadvantage of our family members or spouses. But you know, ultimately we want to disclose what we're talking about, publish it, speak to it at conferences to get feedback, and to ultimately be able to share the hard work that we've been doing. And you need to understand whether or not this is something you want to do given the stage of your development. And again, circling back to the Technology Transfer Office, they'll be able to help give you guidance as far as what to do here. What sort of model are you looking at having ultimately, at the end of the day, commercialization or whatnot of your innovation? Are you looking at it being more of a not-for-profit model, or are you looking to have it commercialized and have industry uptake? And so again, Technology Transfer Office or people with this sort of expertise would be critical to involve in your team to help you guide making these decisions. Where is the demand for this innovation? So in the case of Adam's research, so this sounds like perhaps he's going to approach this by doing an academic clinical trial, unless it's going to be partnered by industry. But at the same point, even if it's going to be an academic clinical trial, likely there's an eye to industry uptake. And so it's important to identify these players and their potential interest early on, because it's important you start having conversations. The geographic location is also important, because, you know, depending on what sort of regulatory application you'll be drafting, it obviously changes depending on the country that you're planning on running the trial in. So for instance, in Canada, we'd be looking at, you know, filing a clinical trial application to Health Canada. And then it's also important to know where it is that you are looking at your innovation being housed. So in the case of a clinical trial, obviously partnering with a hospital that is well known and has the resources that you need to successfully run a clinical trial. All right, why? This is also one that takes a bit of introspection, because likely you've been working on whatever it is you've been working on for a number of years, and clearly you see the importance in it, or else you wouldn't be doing it. But this is where you have to make sure that the reason why you think this is important has superseded the fact, well, it's because you've devoted so much time in figuring it out, versus that it has some clear benefit or interest to the people that will ultimately be receiving this, or the receptors for this. So you need to identify and define the need and how your application or how your innovation applies. And you need to validate that. And so one way to validate this is by engaging your stakeholders through engaging in such mechanisms like key opinion leader discussions or scientific advisory boards. When? So this is a critical one that we'll go into a little bit more in a couple slides, but the idea is you need to be able to set a timeline for what it is that you want to do. And to do that, you have to be able to identify the key activities that you need to accomplish in order to set these timelines. And so I've given a bit of an example here to talk about the idea of these milestones and deliverables. So if the ultimate outcome that you want to accomplish is to achieve or to receive a no objection letter from Health Canada, then one activity that you need to set deliverables milestones for is pre-CTA package. So this is the idea that you're coming up with a package that you're going to submit to Health Canada for them to review. It's not going to be comprehensive. It's not going to be your full clinical trial application, but there's got to be enough information in there about the process, about the therapeutic, about the clinical trial design, so that Health Canada can review, you can ask informed questions, and they in turn can provide informed answers. And so once you have that pre-CTA package, you can then engage with Health Canada and set up a pre-CTA meeting. Sometimes you have pre-CTA meetings, so this is where things are maybe not as mature. You can have as many engagements with Health Canada as you feel you need in order to make sure that you can ultimately satisfy their concerns when you're writing the clinical trial application. obviously then out without bothering them unnecessarily or too many times. But the idea is that these engagements with Health Canada should ultimately inform on your final clinical trial submission. And hopefully, unless Health Canada has been raising red flags along the way, through this collaboration with Health Canada, you should end up with a clinical trial application that should be approved and you should receive your no objection letter. All right, so we move from formulating your plan to implementing your plan. And I think what is paramount here is understanding the translational cost. So this is the idea of how do you balance time and money. So from an academic perspective, we feel perhaps that we have tons of time and not a lot of money. And from an industry perspective, there's never enough time and money is less of a consideration. And so how do you balance that equation? So from an academic perspective, although we may feel like we don't have a lot of money to begin with and that we can take as long as we need to translate our discovery, the fact of the matter is the longer it takes to develop it or to translate it, the higher the total cost of the project ends up being. Also, you run the risk if you take too much time is that technology continues to march forward without you, and perhaps your innovation, which was super interesting and timely 2 years ago, all of a sudden doesn't have a place in the market anymore. So one of the ways to sidestep or to make sure that you have a handle on your time is through the engagement of a project manager. So this is another critical part of the who in formulating your plan. You need a project manager to advocate for your project. And actually, I should correct myself. It's not so much a project at this point, it's a program. There's a number of activities that need to happen in parallel that feed off of one another. There are critical path activities. You know, you need someone who will advocate for the project itself or program itself. You as the investigator, you're advocating for the science. This project manager is going to advocate for getting that project or program delivered on time and on budget. And so what I'm just showing here for people who may not be familiar is just an example of a very simple Gantt chart, which is a very important project management tool that helps you track critical path activities, deliverables, milestones, and their timing. When it comes to money, it's really important at the onset that you have done a fulsome and comprehensive budget of your program. And so this is where, although it takes a lot of time and it doesn't seem, it's not a lot of fun, you need to truly find out what the cost is for everything, every activity it is that you're going to have to do. And that's inclusive of materials, services, for instance, if in Adam's case, they want to manufacture the virus, how much is it going to cost to manufacture the virus? And of course, the full-time employee salary or highly qualified personnel salary. You need to use actual numbers in order to develop as accurate a budget as you possibly can. Also recognizing that you're doing a budget in year 1, certain activities may not come into effect until year 3. And so building in a contingency there to make sure that you're not underestimating your costs. It's also useful to determine when you need the money. So this will tie in just a second when I talk about strategic funding. Monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever makes the most sense. And then breaking that down subsequently too in terms of activity. In this, again, not to belabor the point, but you should make sure that you have a line item also for management. This actually, the budgeting should be part of your project management or your project manager's role. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. So as far as applying for funding, I think fundamentally there are 2 approaches. You let the funding mandate dictate your program, or you let your program mandate dictate what funding you apply to. And I am a firm believer in the latter of the 2, because otherwise I feel like you're trying to jam a square peg into a round hole, like you see here. So as far as having your program mandate dictate what funding you apply to, this is where I reference strategic funding. It does require additional planning, and with that planning, contingencies in case you don't secure certain critical funding opportunities. But the benefit to this, and if you've planned your budget and your milestones and deliverables accordingly, you have an anticipation of when you'll need different types of money. So for instance, you may be looking at the onset to secure preclinical toxicology funds. And so you'd be able to apply to specific funds that traditionally will support that sort of work. Whereas later on, you're looking for translational funds required to manufacture, something that BioCanRx provides through their enabling studies program. So by figuring out what you need when you need it, then you can allow your program to dictate which funding opportunities you're going to apply to. The nice thing also with doing it that way is you basically get to stack. So you'll be able to leverage your previous awards to make your applications for your future asks to be that much stronger. And granting agencies like BioCanRx do look favorably upon how much money that you can leverage. How many dollars can you turn their dollars into? All right. Finally, we're looking at executing our plan. And so I'm not going to get too much into detail with this because clearly this is different depending on every project. But just some key points about things to know about what you need to do to execute your plan. You need to understand there'll be a number of agreements that you're going to have to not only have drafted through your contracts department and executed, so like confidentiality agreements. In the case of if you're getting material from another laboratory because you're collaborating, material transfer agreements. In the case of Adam's program, again, manufacturing of the drug product or the virus, you would need to have a service agreement in place, and then hand in glove with that is also a quality agreement, which protects you in terms of, making sure that what is manufactured meets the specification. And it will be required as part of your clinical trial application. Again, key to executing your plan is this concept of active project management, having someone who is going to advocate for the program throughout to make sure that you're maintaining your timelines and budgets and taking you to task, and your other team members if you're not coming through with your deliverables on time. The active project management is critical to ensuring that the funding, if you're going to do the approach where your program mandate dictates which funds you apply to, it's critical to ensuring that the funding is secured for when you need it, so that a phase of your program isn't held up because you don't have the funds. And active project management is also critical to managing the expectations of all your stakeholders. That way, this is something that becomes very difficult from, I think, a scientific point of view. If it's just all on you, it's not feasible. All right, to finish things off, a couple of lessons that I've learned throughout my journey, either in biomanufacturing or in managing large multi-institutional applications that or projects that have a clinical component. It's really the team is your critical path activity. Your team may ebb and flow throughout the duration of the program as you add expertise, or expertise, might trail off as your program, understandably evolves towards the clinic, and that's okay. But without the proper team, it'll be a lot more difficult for you to be able to answer all the questions and to foresee all of the potential challenges or hurdles. So really think critically about who needs to be on your team. Setting and managing expectations, hand in glove with project management, obviously, is assessing these critical path activities and assigning deliverable dates, let's say. And as much as we'd like to be super keen and say that we'll get it done incredibly quickly, we have to be realistic. Likewise, we also have to make sure that the overall time that we want to deliver on this project is in line with what makes sense for what it is that you are trying to translate, and what, how the environment around you, the landscape around you is changing. Everything costs more than you expect. It's very important because of this to build in contingencies, not only for funding, but time and science as well, and be prepared to adapt. No two programs are ever the same, and nothing ever goes as planned. So learn from your experiences, but be ready to change, to be able to meet the new challenges. And perhaps this is a bit of a plug for BioCanRx, because I feel like this is very much at the core of our mandate is, look for opportunities to collaborate and leverage existing resources. BioCanRx is a network of investigators, and we look to that network to work with one another, and the people within, within that network and their own respective networks to really leverage the expertise of Canadian scientists so that we can provide these new and innovative therapies for the benefit of Canadian cancer patients. So with that, I think I'll pass it back to Megan, and we will start our panel discussion.
Wonderful, thank you, Jen. So if at this point, I could ask the other panelists to turn on their cameras and get ready for some Q&A. And Jen, if you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen, just so it's not.
Oh, unsharing it? How do I do that? Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Great. And Adam, feel free to join on as well. So I'll actually start, Jen, with you with a very basic but broad question. So obviously you talked about pretty much everything translational, and thank you for that. I'm hoping you could maybe do a few touch points on what the key parts of translation are. So a little bit about preclinical development, how it moves into manufacturing, and just touching on those key, I guess, pivot points that you might want to call them.
Sure. So I think you kind of hit on a couple key ones. So, you have whatever the discovery you made in the clinic, but, before you can go to Health Canada, you need to know a little bit more about it. Not so much in the case of, Adam's research. He showed that, 100% of the mice with that combination therapy had overall survival, which is fantastic. And let's say that we can equate that to humans, which would be lovely if that were the case. That's very exciting. But what needs to be done is additional, potentially, preclinical studies. I mean, so Adam is, fortunate using the VSV backbone, that VSV has been used in clinical trials. And one of note is the Ebola vaccine actually uses a VSV backbone. And what he's proposing is using a VSV that is even safer, the Delta 51 variant. And so possibly he can use the fact that this VSV backbone has already been in the clinic before, combined with they've made adjustments to it to make it more safe, to justify not having to go into something as large as a non-human primate, preclinical tox study. But who's to say? So this is where having these engagements, the pre-CTA discussions with Health Canada are super critical. So they can tell him early on that, yes, you are going to have to do it, or no, you're not, because then that in turn will affect how they would approach what money they need to secure and when to pay for that. So let's pretend then for an instance that you're good on the NHP study front, Adam, and they're allowed to proceed through. Now you start looking towards the actual innovation itself and having to understand it from a completely different perspective than before. And by this, I mean, you have to understand how do you make it? How do you make enough of it to a level of purity that would be acceptable to actually put into a person? And again, I'm just talking about in terms of your virus. This is where my level of expertise is. I'm assuming you have some great plan for your NKT cells and manufacturing of that as well. But just from a virus perspective, this is where you start engaging full on in the process development side of things. And this is where then your team switches to include people with manufacturing expertise. So for instance, BioCanRx supports core facilities. And one of these is the Biotherapeutics Manufacturing Center, who manufactures therapeutic viruses. So let's say, for instance, you engage with the BMC, and then together you start developing a process for how to manufacture the virus. All this information that you're gathering, the fact that you don't need to do the NHP study and the justification as to why, the manufacturing criteria and parameters, specification for your product, release testing criteria, all that stuff then gets put into your CTA application. And again, this is a very oversimplification of everything. But then basically, once you have enough information, as you continue to engage with Health Canada, answer their questions, do the additional experiments perhaps that they request, so you provide the justification in your CTA application, then technically you should have a comprehensive CTA application that you submit. And then the idea from there is then you'd have a no objection letter from them that would permit you to actually test it into people. Now that's notwithstanding things like then, ethics boards, onboarding of clinical sites. That's just the one piece, just getting it to the clinic technically. And then it's a whole other set of things after that to actually, between that point and actually putting something into a person.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. And Adam, if I could turn it to you, we do have a question from the audience.
Yeah. So it's not to anyone specific, but in order to have an efficient pipeline for translational medicine, how important is it to hire specific personnel to fill those roles, i.e. a project manager position, patient advocate, consultant? It looks like some of these roles are often given to senior research associates in addition to their other lab responsibilities.
Maybe Jody or Mike, if we could turn to you.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that one. I think it's a great question because, as Jen alluded to, kind of the team that's working on it is probably your most important asset besides your technology to move it forward. And if you don't have the right people around the table and the right people who are invested, it can be kind of a bottleneck to moving it forward. I think where we sometimes find challenges, and you see it quite frequently happening, is, as kind of to the question alluded to, is people from within the lab kind of get titled with certain things like project manager or business manager. And that can be really great because they do have the tie to the technology, they understand the technology really intimately, and they can kind of see where it's going. But also I find sometimes the people within the lab don't necessarily have the expertise to execute on that. Just because you have that title doesn't mean you have kind of that education and that background to have those conversations and really bring the expertise that role is needed. So I think one way you can kind of pivot and bring in both your lab, and I definitely understand where labs want to encourage the people who've been spending, 5-6 years working on the technology. You don't want to cut them out when it gets to this really exciting stage where you are ready to bring it forward. But having a team of consultants or people that can work part-time for your technology, especially depending, if it's something that you're trying to commercialize or do small scale with an institution, it's not really realistic to hire on a full-time regulatory and a full-time business manager and those full-time roles. It's not feasible to be able to maintain that. The workload and the finances, I think, are going to be prohibitive. But being able to have those expertise or work with a mentor who can provide that perspective, but then also train the members of your lab who are interested in developing those skill sets. So it's not that they're not going to have that role, but it's just that they can work with somebody who has a bit more experience to kind of both train to help the technology, but then also help their own career development.
Yeah, I'll just add into that. And as Jen has described, there's this sort of perfect team that you'd like to have, and which is completely true. Unfortunately, from a funding standpoint, in most cases, again, what Jody's saying is you can't afford to have a full-time consultant. So I think what happens in a lot of grants is, again, just what Jody just said, is that you will see people with those titles, but they actually don't do that job. They don't actually have the expertise. But in the absence of funding to do that, at least it's better than something. So what I find, and we did a survey of industry sort of asking them some of their issues with dealing with academic research, and that was the sort of number one thing was lack of understanding of where you are in the development cycle. So Jen talked about that in her presentation, is you have a plan, understand where you actually are in it, and at that time, hire the consultant you need at that time. So I have groups that will hire, say at your time, Adam, they talk about hiring someone who's going to help them with reimbursement. And I'm sort of thinking, that's wonderful to have someone, but way too early to look at those things, So if everything was equal and you had lots of money, great to have them on the team at the time. But I think understanding where you are on the development cycle and who will best help you with the plan is one of the most important things you can do.
And maybe just one other point, I love kind of that idea, Mike. And one other thing I think where people get a little too tied to their technologies is they want to keep it within their lab group and they want to keep it within themselves, where if it's moving to more of a clinical trial, maybe even though it's your technology, you might not be the best person to kind of drive that secondary step. So having that team may actually be, releasing it to somebody else who may be able to kind of move it to that next stage.
Just quickly to that point, this idea of de-risking, what Jody's saying, researchers definitely get caught up in their own research. And I think that's why I went to academia, because I love the passion that someone like Adam brings to his research. We don't necessarily have that same passion in industry. Sometimes it's just a job for us. But the reality is that, NIH right now, we have a center grant. They are actually, what Jody's just saying, they're actually asking us to bring in a third-party scientist or somebody to an evaluation of the research, because they're not sort of, completely up to it knee level. And that's how we de-risk it. So before they will fund the next round of financing, we actually bring in 3 people, one who's a commercial person, one who's a research person, one who's a regulatory person, and they de-risk that technology by taking a true look at it. So as Jody said, taking that step back really is important, and sometimes is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Wonderful. And I'll just make a note to participants. Again, don't hesitate to either write any questions that you have in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question orally. So with that being said, we'll again keep monitoring the questions coming in. And oh, I'm sorry.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can. Yep, go ahead. Julian?
Hey, sorry, just had I have a question. What sort of level of in vivo kind of POC data is like Health Canada looking for? And then on like the investor biotech side, like, is having a few different mouse models in vivo with curative response, is that going to be good enough? Or do you have to take that into a few different animal models, or how far do you go before you really make that dive?
I can jump in there first, and you're going to hate my first answer, because I'm going to say it depends on what type of research. If you're the first in class type of product, then the requirements from Health Canada are a little bit higher from the animal model standpoint, because no one else has done that before. I think one of the hardest things to do, but one of the best things you can do moving forward, is try and understand if there's a precedent for an animal model that has been used by Health Canada in the past for approval of that type of disease state. And I will guarantee you that if Adam and I sat down and I talked about animal models, Adam would quickly tell me the ones that are being used by Health Canada aren't very good, and we get into a very heated discussion about why they weren't. But at the end of the day, that's the science part of things. But basically, again, what Jen talked about is if your ultimate goal is to commercialize it or get it out into the general public, you have to understand that at the end of the day, Health Canada owns the bat, the ball, and the bases, and they get to decide whether you're moving forward to it. So sometimes it's a little difficult to sort of swallow your pride and understand that. So industry understands that also, that, again, in a project right now with TMJ, where there are no precedents for animal models, we've had conversation after conversation what that should be. And in a meeting both with the FDA and Health Canada, they basically said, you guys come to us and provide us with the information to support the animal model you choose. And so just doing it in animal models, whether it be 2 different species, isn't necessarily always enough. You have to make sure that that animal model is indicative of the disease state and something that will be accepted by the regulators down the road. There's nothing worse than going to a commercial entity and present them your results, and it's an area that they have some expertise in, and they say, well, that's great, Adam, but by the way, Health Canada requires you do that in mini pigs or something like that. And again, sometimes you have to swallow a bit of pride, because it isn't just about the science sometimes. You have to remember that regulators really do like precedent, and if they've used that before and it hasn't been an issue, that's your safest route moving forward. Doesn't mean you have to. Just take in mind that you will have to defend why you've used a different animal model.
Yeah, I would very much second that. I think the most important thing is doing your homework and kind of knowing what other people have done in this space. And from a Health Canada perspective, what models they have done previously. And if you feel that that's not the most indicative model for your system, have a good rationale of why. And being able to kind of articulate that, whether it's to industry or to Health Canada, but kind of describing that, we did investigate, we did look at putting it into a large animal model, but we didn't think it would be adding value to the study because of X, Y, and Z. They may still push you back and say, that's great, but we still want to see that study done, in which case, do the study. But I think having kind of a good backup answer and some good rationale of why you chose to design your studies in that way and in that format, and not the rationale not being kind of just because you wanted to move it faster or it was cheaper to not do that study. So having early conversations with industry or with Health Canada to say, if we're going to be moving this forward, what would you like to see in order to allow you to approve it, is also important, and setting realistic expectations of what they want to see, so you don't spend 2 years working on a model and then they say, we didn't really want to see that type of model anyways. We want you to do this experiment instead.
And just to further on Jody's point there, like that's why you're talking about these pre-CTA meetings. You know, that's the engagement with Health Canada to ask these questions. And you do need a baseline, I guess, of information about what it is you plan to do, but it's kind of your opportunity to feel it out with them. So for instance, with Adams, you know, because VSV has been used as a vaccine in people before, is that enough to justify not having to do a non-human primate study? And those are the sorts of questions that need to be put forward to Health Canada, let them answer that, and then you move on. So you don't waste time or money, or instead of doing the other alternative, just going ahead and doing what you think you need, you submit your CTA application almost in a vacuum, and then it gets rejected. I mean, I fundamentally feel that the whole approach with Health Canada is to find ways to make your innovation, find a path for innovation into the clinic if there's a reason to do so. That's what they're there for. And the only way to get them to help you to do that is by reaching out to them and having these sorts of informed discussions.
And maybe Jen or any of the other panelists, how soon is too soon to engage with Health Canada? When do you reach out regarding that pre-CTA meeting?
I think that there's a balance too that needs to be struck, that you're not constantly engaging with them as well. But I also feel like I defer this to Mike to answer. That's all right.
Thanks very much, Jen. Throw me under the bus. I appreciate that.
A little bit.
Well, it's quite funny because it's an ongoing discussion. And what Jen just said, if you do too early, it's not a good thing. Reputation means something. You know, if you come in and you're not prepared, not a good first sort of, you know, first impression with Health Canada. As Megan said earlier, I spent 10 years in the United States, just moved back last year, luckily in good time. But in the United States, you don't have the opportunity to have more than one pre-IND or pre-CTA meeting. From a legislative standpoint, you're only allowed one. So it controls what you're going to do because you have to ask all your important questions up front. So I believe that, you know, basically you have to have some data before you go. I think only because of the fact that Health Canada will allow you to come and ask questions, but I think you need to show that you have some data and some type of a plan. So in my mind, what you're doing in the early pre-CTAs is you're showing Health Canada what your development plan is, including animal models, what testing parameters, things like that, and then basically getting them to say, yes, that makes sense, that we would like to see moving forward. And as Jody said, that stops you from having spent 2 years doing the study, and Health Canada says, well, that's not the appropriate study to do. So I think Health Canada is really good at that. And again, you know, sort of by definition, you can have as many meetings as you want, but I think definitely there is such thing as too many meetings.
Thank you. And do we have any questions from participants? Oral questions? Okay, and if you do, feel free to just jump in and interrupt. So Jody, I'm going to look back to you and ask you to talk a little bit more about the academic industry partnership. How does that develop? When does that develop? What does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to steal Mike's line from earlier. It all depends, because I think one thing when we think about kind of partnerships in industry and academic working together, it's both the timing, but also having the right partner. A lot of times, kind of the main thing we're working towards is that dollar. We want dollars to fund our research. And there's a lot that we can work with industry around that's maybe not dollar specific. So when you're thinking about engaging with industry and doing these industry academic partnerships, I would say think about what you really want out of them and what you want out of your industry partners. So is it just that financial money to move it forward, or are you looking for, you know, expertise or connections that industry partner can provide for you? And depending what those kind of asks are, it will change kind of who and how you engage with them. So if you're looking for something that is more, you know, financially driven, you just want money to do this clinical trial, that's something that's going to be a bit more hands-off, I would say. It's not as much of kind of a co-creation and conversation, versus if it is something where you really want to have their expertise and their insights, having a conversation very early on in the technology will help kind of leverage and build that partnership up where they can see where you're going. They can point out maybe some flaws or holes that you may not be able to see at that stage, and then kind of working through that pipeline together. Each industry partner works very differently. Some are much more amenable to kind of that funding only perspective, and then other ones really want to have that kind of co-creation and that collaborative approach. The other thing I would just kind of highlight, because this is something I didn't really understand too much when I was on the not-for-profit side, was there's also a lot of limitations of what companies and pharmaceutical companies or certain commercial companies can actually pay for. So also doing a little bit of due diligence on before you have those conversations to understand what they actually can and cannot fund. And that will kind of help to make sure that you're not asking them for something that is just out of the spectrum of what they can actually pay for.
Thank you. And I'd actually like to take that last bit of what you said and basically ask all three panelists, what are common mistakes that you see from folks from the academic side that are trying to translate their project? And how might you recommend overcoming those potential barriers?
I think for me, the first, and I think not the easiest one to address, but as scientists, I think, is understanding that, you know, one of Health Canada's major concern is the safety of the patients that will be enrolled in the clinical trials. So Adam's a perfect example, and I'm not beating up on Adam here, is the fact that the data he showed us was the 100% survival rate. There's nothing about any type of side effects. And a lot of times when you do a combination therapy, the reason for doing that is because you can decrease dose and increase. So my biggest recommendation is, even when you're developing your early on animal studies, whether it be in a mouse, whether it be in a rat, start thinking about some of the safety parameters that you can measure. And what's becoming, I think, again, back to what Jody and I are both jumping on, it depends. But what I'm finding a lot happening more often is the regulators expecting a longer term follow-up with your animal models. So even if it's an acute disease state, rather than just having a 6-week animal model, I think you have to start learning about keeping some of your animals longer. And when I say it doesn't have to be statistically significant, I'm not telling you to keep, 10 animals, but it starts to give you some indication whether you're going to have any problems down the road. So I think in my mind, and again, my funded research in the United States was looking at how do we improve this. That seemed to be the one that had the biggest effect moving forward, because again, back to what was asked earlier, what does industry look for? It's not just the efficacy side, they're also looking at the safety side. So just early on in all of your animal studies, right from day one, start thinking about what potential safety parameters I should measure. And if you can do them in your early animal studies, it's a great way to move things forward, because then what you don't do is you don't end up with a big surprise moving forward. And a lot of times that happens all the time. So I think that's the simplest one. Really doesn't affect your funding. You don't need tons of money to do that. Just start thinking about the safety parameters when you design your animal studies.
Yeah, and I would second that. I would say one of the biggest kind of pitfalls and challenges we see is people being too optimistic of their data and not sharing what the weaknesses are. We all know as researchers, the technology has weaknesses, whether it's going to be the scale up or whether it's going to be the model of choice or safety parameters, and being able to be honest about that, because a lot of the weaknesses and the challenges are actually going to cost more in the long run and take longer time than the perfect situation where realistically it's probably not going to happen. So being able to have that conversation and have that reality of, this is what we want to do, these are some of the challenges associated with it. Don't worry, we have a contingency plan. This is what we're going to do if that challenge arises, or this is how we're going to try to address that, I think is a good way of turning a weakness into an opportunity. And it's a lot better if you point out that weakness early on than getting really deep into conversations and then having one of their scientists or somebody from Health Canada point out that weakness. It's a lot better, I would say, go in preemptively, show your cards, say this is what we're working towards, because it sets up a better partnership and a good level of transparency between both organizations.
Yeah, and just to circle back, I think on both of your points, it seems like this wanting to be overly optimistic is something that we really have to question a bit. So I would like to take a look at it from the perspective of budgeting, because as much as we'd like to think that things will happen for less money and also time, in a very short period of time, I think it's very important at the beginning to be aware of how much it will cost in terms of both money and time. And so taking it from the perspective, you know, as a funder through BioCanRx, you know, it's important to do your due diligence to figure out what the true cost is of whatever it is that you want to do. I mean, a great example is a lot of times, you know, through our core facilities, people engage with them and are looking to manufacture a product and are shocked at the cost. And here's the thing though too, with our core facilities, you know, because they're not for profit, this isn't your typical model. It's actually a fraction of the cost or less than what you would do if you're going to a traditional CDMO. So it's a bit of an education. I think more than anything, you have to educate yourself. And there are lots of tools out there to help you educate yourself. I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I meant to mention in my presentation, I forgot, is how do you know to ask the questions you don't know to ask? And I think that this goes hand in glove with building your team, because also to know how to build your team appropriately, you know, if you've never done this before, how do you build it appropriately? And so this is something I think kind of speaks as close to your heart, Mike, with the whole idea of mentorship, because this is where having a mentor or, you know, either industry or academic or however the case may be, to help guide you in terms of, you know, your first time at this, what do I do and who do I need? You know, this is where a mentorship program really, I think would better the state of things for people trying this for the first time.
Thanks to all three of you for your
Another
insights on that.
question, Megan?
Yeah, go ahead, Julian.
Okay. So I just have a general question, kind of advice the panelists could give for kind of navigating the patent landscape. So if you have a new idea and you have to go through TDO and get it patented, what are things you should really look out for? I mean, a lot of this is the first time you're dealing with something like this, and it's a lot of kind of lawyer talk and contract talk. But what are key things that you really have to be aware of when you're designing or writing out that patent?
And maybe I'll ask just one of you to answer that question. I'm mindful of time, so this may be the last question before we wrap up.
Who wants it?
We're all jumping to take that one, aren't we?
Yeah, gotta be honest, it's not my area of expertise there.
Yeah, well, you know, I'll just sort of jump in, and it's something that I deal with all the time. And I used to always say bad things about lawyers, but my son is now an IP lawyer, so he's told me to stop saying bad things about lawyers. You know, I think that your comment about patenting, I think a lot of academics will come to me and say, I'm not going to worry about patenting because I don't worry about making money and I don't worry about commercializing. And I think that's a very short-sighted way of looking at things, because if you want, during the COVID crisis now, you know, at OHRI, we're developing a vaccine and a treatment. And that's a conversation I have, is that if that works and all of a sudden now you want to get it out to the whole Canadian public, how will that happen? And unfortunately, in most cases, it has to be some type of a commercial partner. You know, there are some not-for-profit situations. You could have, you know, the government say have a CMO manufacture it, but as Jen knows better than I do, there's not that many CMOs in Canada that could do that type of quantity. So I think sometimes when you look at the patent thing, it isn't just about you know, trying to make money off this or trying to find a commercial partner, which is obviously very, very important. But if you truly want your technology, your treatment to make it out into the general public and treat as many patients as you possibly can, you have to think about what those avenues are. And in all honesty, the main one requires that you have type of a patent. So unfortunately, you know, I actually believe that, you know, you go to your tech transfer office, and again, as a researcher, you have no idea what types of questions to ask them. I'm a big believer that that's one area that having a mentor or somebody is a great thing to do, because of the fact that, and this is not meant to be a knock on tech transfer offices, who's an expert in your technology, you know, and they may not have that expert in that technology. And I'm sure Jody would tell you that one of the biggest mistakes that you can make sometimes when you're trying to attract a commercial partner is a bad patent, because that's a value to the company as they move forward. So in my mind, there's a lot more value in a good patent than people think about. It's the one area that if you have the ability to go out and find somebody, and I will tell you, there are people out there that specialize, like for example, what Adam's working on, there are patent agencies patent lawyers who specialize just in that area. You know, it's usually not even that expensive to go and talk to them. But I think do your homework on that if you can.
All right, thank you, Mike. So I think that wraps up this panel discussion. And again, I just want to thank all 4 of you for presenting your data, Adam, for giving the presentation, Jen, and for all of your expertise and insight. I did have 1 or 2 questions come in. Unfortunately, the timing isn't available to ask them, so I may reach out to you after the fact. And to the other participants, if there are any final questions, feel free to relay them to me. I'll be sending out an email with the survey that I also put in the chat box, and I'm sure I can kindly ask and volunteer the panels to perhaps weigh in on those. But I really appreciate you guys taking part in this webinar. I think it was very, very insightful. So thanks again.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks to the participants. Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.